on and give God a praise for God's grace and God's mercy.
But once again, thanks for the invitation. Today is a very special Veterans Day for me. Number one, for this invitation, it really floored me when Bishop Barber asked me to come and speak before you. And another reason is, as you know, I'm a veteran. I'm an Army veteran, and I got to tell you a quick story about a short time I had in Korea back in the 1980s. There are specific events that I remember vividly, and then I've forgotten a lot because it's been a long time. But some of the stuff that I remember is quite vivid. because of who brought these memories to me. I have this friend who's been a friend of mine for over 30 years. And for a period after I separated from the Army, I lost him and I couldn't find him. He was like my best buddy in the Army. And meeting him in Korea was kind of odd. He was this kid from Long Island, New York, with a high top fade. First time I saw him, he had on a Wayne Gretzky jersey and a lacrosse stick in his hand. And when he would stand in formation, when we weren't doing anything, he'd reach into his cargo pocket and pull out the autobiography of Malcolm X and start reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. And he was about 18 years old at the time. I was about 26. And I'm like, who is this dude? He's just a walking contradiction. He's got a lacrosse stick, a hockey jersey, a Public Enemy shirt, and he's reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. Who is this brother? And we got to know each other. We got to be very good friends. We went from Korea to Washington State together. I hadn't seen him in 30 years until about 8 hours ago. I picked him up at the airport, and he's here. Now, what he used to always tell me was that he was going to always make sure that he lived his dreams. One of the things that I learned about him when I met him was that as soon as I met him, maybe a couple of months before I met him, both of his parents had died a month apart. He was 18 years old. So I kind of took it upon myself to try to look out for him. And he ended up looking out for me probably more than I did him. Wow. I did teach him how to drive because people from New York don't drive. So, but he told me, he said, Smitty, still calls me Smitty to this day. He says, man, I'm going to live my dreams, man, and you'll see one day. His dream was to be heavily involved in the game of lacrosse. So, Larry Mackey, would you please stand up, sir? This brother right here, his dream has taken him to the head coaching job of Puget Sound University men's lacrosse team. And just, I think the day, Bishop, you text me and asked me to speak here, out of the blue, he texts me and says, Smitty, I am now the national coach for the men's World Cup Uganda lacrosse team. So he says, I got to come to North Carolina and visit you after 30 years. The only time I can get a ticket out is November 9th. I said, fine. We'll be at Greenleaf November 10th. Larry Mackey. Now, to some solemn thoughts on Veterans Day and some of the anniversaries that we're observing. Some of you historians may be aware that today is the 121st anniversary of the Wilmington coup. Yeah, and so I'll just ask that we remember that today too, as we honor our veterans. And of course, today is the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day. Now, history usually explains it as the 11th hour, 11th day, 11th month of 2018. But the actual first event occurred in Buckingham Palace on November 10th, when King George of Great Britain hosted the French president in a banquet of honor, November 10th, 1919. So, but what I want to do is speak from Scripture, and the Lord has led me to invoke what I believe to be the spirit of Matthew 23, 2 through 3. Matthew 23, 2 and 3. And it reads, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you be careful to do everything they tell you. But do not what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them." So I'm afraid at times we as citizens of this nation and our government have acted as did the scribes and the Pharisees of Matthew 23, 2 and 3 when it comes to the treatment of our veterans. Okay. And before I forget, tomorrow, Golden Corral, Red Lobster, Chili's, Applebee's, Outback, Olive Garden, Texas Roadhouse, Red Robin, IHOP, Dunkin' Donuts, Cracker Barrel, White Castles, Buffalo Wild Wings, and even Home Depot has freebies for veterans. But that's one day a year. That's a freebie, one day a year. But how have we treated our veterans? As you sit here drooling a little bit after all of that, it's important to point out that this is part of the puzzling hypocrisy of Matthew 23, 2, and 3. And it begins far back, way before the United States Constitution. Daniel Shays, an American veteran of the American War for Independence against British tyranny, had to lead a revolt because when he returned from serving in the Revolutionary War, banks had foreclosed on his property and his friend's property, and the mistreatment of veterans began quite early. That was 1786, a year before the Constitutional Convention. So this year marks another anniversary. Several, actually, but the one I want to talk about now is the Red Summer of 1919. 100 years ago was Red Summer. In a speech on the Senate floor in 1917, Mississippi Senator James K. Vardaman warned that the return of black soldiers to the South would inevitably lead to disaster. Once you impress the Negro with the fact that he is defending the flag and inflate his untutored soul with military airs, Vardaman cautioned, is a short step to the conclusion that his political rights must be respected. This speech preceded the Red Summer by 2 years. According to Equal Justice Initiative, African-American veterans returned home from World War I eager to continue to fight for freedom at home. Many black soldiers returned from war with a newfound determination to bring freedom to their own shores. W.E.B. Du Bois proclaimed in 1919 in Crisis editorial entitled "Returning Soldiers, we return from fighting, we return fighting." Red Summer refers to a series of approximately 25 anti-black riots that erupted in major cities throughout the nation in 1919, including Houston, Texas, East St. Louis and Chicago, Illinois, Washington, D.C., Omaha, Nebraska, Elaine, Arkansas, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Charleston, South Carolina. And in Elaine, Arkansas, whites attacked a meeting of black sharecroppers who were organizing to demand fairer treatment in the cotton market. After a white person was shot, federal troops were called in to quell the violence, but instead they joined white mobs in hunting black residents for several days. More than 200 black men, women, and children were murdered. According to Equal Justice Initiative founder Brian Stevenson, your friend Ben, it just became evident when we were doing research on lynching and racial terror that black veterans were particularly vulnerable. They were prime targets for the violence that terrorized African Americans between Reconstruction and World War II. Right here in North Carolina, in Nash County, J.C. Farmer, a veteran from Nash County, was shot by a mob after a law enforcement officer attacked him for laughing at a bus stop. Also in 1946 in Walton County, Georgia, a veteran named George Dorsey was killed. He and his wife and another couple were dragged from a car near a rural bridge and shot dozens of times. This is the infamous Moore's Ford killing. So much of the resistance to African American citizenship was borne by veterans, many times returning from war and many times in uniform. General Benjamin O. Davis Sr., United States Army, African American, was asked to visit and inspect the troops of the 92nd Division in Fort Huachuca, Arizona in 1943, only to find that when he entered into the all-whites officers club, that German prisoners of war were sitting in the officers club where he could not sit and eat. He had to go out back after he got his plate. But he's a general officer in the United States Army. Yeah. So 1943, also in that year, Langston Hughes, my favorite poet, he wrote this poem. It's entitled Beaumont, From Beaumont to Detroit. Looky here, America, what you done. Let things drift until the riots come. Now your police let your mobs run free. I reckon you don't care nothing about me. You tell me that Hitler is a mighty bad man. I guess he took lessons from the Ku Klux Klan. You tell me that Mussolini's got an evil heart. Well, it must have been in Beaumont where he got his start. Because everything that Hitler and Mussolini do, Negroes get the same treatment from you. You Jim Crowed me before Hitler rose to power, and you still Jim Crowing me this very hour. Yet you say we're fighting for democracy. Then why don't democracy include me? I ask you this question because I want to know how long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow. Then we moved to the Vietnam era. The lynchings subsided some, but they didn't go away. Many of us know the story of Dickie Morrow, 23-year-old Army veteran right here in Oxford, North Carolina, who was murdered in cold blood on the streets of Oxford by white assailants who claimed that he was talking to, in a fresh way, a white woman. And all white juries, of course, acquitted him, as is the common mode of social justice in the South. By the Vietnam War, home ownership was a primary driver for the post-war economic security and wealth accumulation, and it spurred the creation and growth of suburban white America. But it was obvious that this was not intended to accrue to African Americans. A survey of 13 Mississippi cities found that African Americans received 2 of 3,229 home, business, and farm loans administered by the VA in 1947. 2. In New York, in northern New Jersey suburbs, 67,000 mortgages were insured by the GI Bill, but fewer than 100 were taken out by non-whites. So from Shays' Rebellion through the Civil War, the Red Scare, and on through the Vietnam era, and into the Walter Reed scandal of a few years ago and the Veterans Administration scandal, we as a nation at times behave as the scribes and the Pharisees in Matthew, forgetting that the sacred commandment to love one another is just that. It's sacred. We forget to lessen the burdens that we as a nation ask our men, women, active service members, and veterans in uniform to bear. But guess what? This is where I invoke my grandfather and my father. My grandfather was a member of the 808th Pioneer Infantry Regiment that was sent to France in 1918, World War I. He never saw any combat because, well, he was in a black unit. But he was a deacon in the church till the day he died. He was a praying man. And I think that he would say about the burdens that are spoken of in Matthew that he knows a man. A man who says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart. And you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy to bear. And the burden I give you is light." Also in Psalms 81, "I removed the burden from their shoulders. Their hands were set free from the basket. In your distress you called, and I rescued you. I answered you out of the thundercloud. I tested you at the waters of Meribah." In Psalm 55 and 22. Turn your burdens over to the Lord, and he will take care of you, and he will never let the righteous person stumble. Thank you, Greenleaf. Peace.
So Professor Smith and I never talked about what he would say to us and the stage that he would set today. My first time hearing. And this week, the Lord put on my heart for this homily to talk about the call to protect and protest a nation. That we have a call, veterans and all, to protect and protest the nation. I had Deacon Grady say what Jeremiah said to the people of his day when the nation was not being just. The Lord told Jeremiah and all, including any of those who may have been veterans, this is what I need some people to do. Go to the king and tell them, do what is just and right, rescue from the hand of the oppressor, do no wrong or violence to the immigrant, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place. And if you do this, then God will keep the nation. But if you don't, God will bring the nation to ruin. And then Jesus, headed toward the cross, told us exactly how nations would be judged. Ultimately, not by the height of their skyscrapers, not by the power of their weaponry, and not by the money and finances in their banks. But he said, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, when he comes, he will gather all the nations, and he will make them stand before him. And he will separate the nations, one as a shepherd separates sheep from goats. Matthew 25. And he will put the nations that have been like sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And then the king or the rulers of those nations will say, then God will say to those on his right, you are the blessed of my Father as a nation. And I've prepared a kingdom now for you greater than your nation. And the reason is, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was a stranger, you invited me in. When I needed clothes, you clothed me. When I was sick, you looked after me. When I was in prison, you visited me. And then that nation will say, Lord, when did we see you in all of these ways? And God will say, whenever you did it to the least of your citizens, the least of your brothers and sisters, you did it unto me. And then he will say to those on the left, the nations on the left, the nations, depart from me. For I don't know you. Because when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was thirsty, you didn't give me anything to drink. When I was an immigrant, you didn't invite me in. When I was sick, you did not visit me. And so as a nation now, you must suffer. When you know the Bible and when you know what Professor Smith has said, then we understand that any Veterans Day cannot merely be a time to wrap ourselves in the glory of the flag and talk about American exceptionalism. If we were in China, it couldn't I'd be saying. If I was in Korea, Japan, Africa, any nation, no nation can simply laud itself. Every nation must take inventory of itself. I did not know that Professor Smith was going in this direction, but I'm glad he did, because it says to me that this congregation and all those listening online, thousands, need to hear this message twice. 100 years ago, this nation was in the same mess it's in right now. 100 years ago, there was a narcissist, racist as president of the United States. Seems like we would have learned 100 years ago. There was great distrust, dislike, and oppression of immigrants. At that time, though, the wall that people were putting up was on the eastern shores to block immigrants from Europe. 100 years ago. 100 years ago, a president was speaking racism from the Oval Office and was spewing the kind of rhetoric that would create violence. 100 years ago, 1919. 100 years ago, black veterans who had defended this nation and who sang the Star-Spangled Banner and who waved the flag returned home to a racist president who said that if we don't stop these black veterans, they will sow communism into the veins of the democracy. And his words, the president's words, helped unleash violent riots against black soldiers and any white soldiers that dared to stand with those black soldiers. The riots were unleashed by the words of the president and senators, like you heard from Professor Smith, to put these black men in their place. Because these black men came back home and they said, no longer will we give first-class blood for second-class citizenship. And the black veterans and the white veterans that had become brothers and in the war became a threat to Jim Crow and white nationalism. And they had protected protected this country. And they said because of that, we have a right to protest this country. That was where we were 100 years ago. I was just this past week in Corbin, Kentucky, where on October 30th, 1919, all of the black men and women and children, including the veterans, were rounded up because somebody lied and said an African American had committed a crime, and they put all of them on a train, a boxcar, did not give them time to get any of their belongings, and said, you will be out of this county by sundown or you will be dead. Because that whole summer from Chicago to Corbin, Kentucky, black veterans were being murdered just for standing up with their back straight. Just because they came back from the war and said there's no way we're going to fight for this country, and then come back and accept second-class citizenship. And for that all over this country. And I was in Corbin, Kentucky, where black and white people have now come together, and they're trying to unlive that ugly history. Corbin, Kentucky, one of the counties that flipped this past week, but they could not flip until they owned this history, the history that grew out of a racist president named Woodrow Wilson 100 years ago. A racist president, a president of Princeton University and the former governor of New Jersey, not a Southerner, but he played Birth of a Nation in the Oval Office. And Brother Wilbur, when he saw a black man like you in a World War I uniform, he saw you as a threat to democracy, even though you had just put your life on the line for democracy. And it was James Weldon Johnson that called it the Red Summer. The same James Weldon Johnson that wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. It was James Weldon Johnson. It took a musician, it took a poet to come up with a metaphor for that moment. And he called it Red Summer to symbolize two things. Number one, that just because you were black and a soldier, racists automatically saw you as a communist, as a hater of democracy. They were afraid because those soldiers had seen freedom in other countries. They left here, segregated, went to France, and they could sit with anybody. And it was also called Red Summer because of all the blood, the red blood from black bodies that poured down the streets and the sidewalks of America. W.B. Du Bois wrote this piece. You heard Professor reference it. I didn't know he was going to reference it, but the Holy Spirit did. May 1919, W.B. Du Bois, I was a strong writer. He wrote, the reason you get a magazine, if you remember the NAACP, called The Crisis, is because W. Bois said, we have a crisis. It was never meant to be a magazine where you just go in and read cute stories. The design of that magazine was supposed to be to point out the crisis in the country as it related to racism and poverty. W.B. Du Bois said, we are returning from war. The Crisis magazine and tens of thousands of black men were drafted into a great struggle for bleeding France and what she means and has meant and will mean to us and humanity, and against the threat of German race arrogance. We fought gladly and to the last drop of blood for America and her highest ideals. We fought in far-off hope for the dominant Southern oligarchy entrenched in Washington. We fought in bitter resignation for the America that represents and gloats in lynching, disenfranchisement, caste, brutality, and devilish insult. For this, in the hateful upturning of mixing things, we were forced by vindictive fate to fight also. But today we return. We return from the slavery of uniform, which the world's madness demanded us to don, to the freedom of civil garb. We stand again to look America squarely in the face and call a spade a spade. That's where that phrase comes from. Comes from W. Boys writing about veterans. We come to call America a spade is a spade. We sing this country of ours despite all of its better souls have done and dreamed. This country is yet a shameful land. He said, this country lynches. This country disenfranchises its own citizens. This country encourages ignorance, will not educate the Negro. A dominant minority does not want the Negro educated. It won't serve. This is Du Bois. This country wants servants educated, dogs educated, whores educated, monkeys educated, but it doesn't want black folk educated. This country steals from us. It organizes to cheat us. It cheats us out of our land. Now that we are returning back to this country, the very jobs we held while the country was at war, now you're taking them from us. This country taxes us without representation, steals our profit. This country insults us, and uses all kind of worldwide propaganda. This is the country to which the soldiers of democracy return. This is the fatherland for which we fought. But it is our fatherland. It was our right for us to fight. And the faults of our country are our faults. And under similar circumstances, we would fight again. But by the God of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if now that the war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. The boys said, ain't no way a man or a woman should be a veteran in this country and go to foreign shores and fight for freedom and then come back here and be quiet. Come back here and be scared. Come back here and not be involved. Come back here and just say, I got my pension. I don't care what's going on with other folk. No. Du Bois said, we must return. And we must return fighting. Make way, democracy, he said. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah God, we're going to save democracy in these United States of America because we return fighting. Truth be told, it was black veterans that started the civil rights movement. Black veterans of yesteryear, for the most part, many of them never allowed the country to brainwash them to the point that they could come back home and just be quiet and say, my country wrong or right. Real black veterans said, if I was willing to put my life on the line, I'm not going to come back here and suffer under second-class citizenship. My father, Reverend Dr. William Joseph Barber I, and the reason he called himself the first and me the second, because he would not allow people to call me Junior. He said every man must have his own identity, even though if he has another man's name. So first, second, third. My father, 25 years after Red Summer, was drafted into a segregated Navy. But before the war was over, it had to integrate. My father, like others, fought to protect this country from Nazism. And he often told me he would do it again. But he also reserved the right to protest this nation. He said, I will not fight to protect this nation and then come back and be quiet and not protest her when she's wrong. The same history is the history of the Star-Spangled Banner. Many soldiers sang the first verse. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Black soldiers, even segregated black soldiers, sang that song and meant it and fought under it. But long before Kaepernick and others, they knew they had to protest the third verse, both in music and in reality. O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave, and where is the band who so vauntantly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion at home and a country should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and the slave. That reference is a reference to black men in 1812, in the War of 1812, who chose to fight with the British because the British gave them freedom. And the writer of the Star-Spangled Banner was a slaveholder. He was a promoter of Jim Crow. Black veterans and their white brothers and sisters that have supported them had to always engage in this kind of curious existence. On the one hand, they could sing the reality of the first verse, but on the other hand, they had to protest the realities of the second verse. And we're in the same Star-Spangled Banner that uplifts the nation, also pays homage to the slaughter of black veterans of the British Army who only left America because America would not let them be free. But I wonder, have you ever heard these words of the National Anthem? Oh, say, do you hear at the dawn's early light the shrieks of those bondmen whose blood is now streaming? From the merciless lash while our banner in sight with its stars marking freedom, its fitful gleaming. Do you see the backs bare? Do you mark every score of the whip of the driver trace channels of gore? And say, doth our Star-Spangled Banner yet wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave? On the shore dimly seen through the mist of the deep, where Africa's race is false safety repose, what is that which the breeze or the towering steep, as it heedlessly sweeps, half concealed, half disclosed? 'Tis a slave ship that's seen by the morning's first beam, and its tarnished reflection pollutes now the stream. 'Tis our Star-Spangled Banner, oh, when shall it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Oh, when shall it wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave? You probably haven't heard those verses. But those verses are when the abolitionists took the tune of the Star-Spangled Banner and wrote their own. White abolitionists who stood with black folk. And they asked the question using that same tune. Oh, say, they used this. They said, they said, oh, say, do you hear at the dawn's early light the shrieks of the bondsmen whose blood is now streaming? They took the same song and transposed the words, transliterated, if you will, the words, so that the tone was the same, but the words were the words of freedom, abolition, and justice. Have we not had to do the same thing? It was Amazing Grace, written by a former slave trader. Reverend Bell was reminding me last week, it is one of the few songs that can be played with all black keys. And some say that Newton, well, actually what the tune for the Amazing Grace was the hum and the mourning of the slaves in the bottom of the slave ship, and it haunted him so bad that when he turned from being a slave ship captain to an abolitionist, the hum, the moans, the groans of the pain came up in out of him, and he sat down and wrote, Amazing grace, because that's what he had heard the slaves singing. In the bottom of those ships. And that's why we sing it with such power. And that's why you can go anywhere, Episcopal, Pentecostal, black church where black folk are, and you can start that line. Care where you are. You can be in the Kennedy Center, or you can be in a down-home storefront church. If somebody can just start to moan, people will pick it up. Amazing grace. And so here we are today, 119 years later. And we remember all of our veterans and those who have protected this nation from real dangers. But also today, as people of faith, we remember all of the veterans who protested this nation. All of the veterans who made up the civil rights movement and every other movement that has demanded that this nation be a more perfect union, regardless of their color. Every nation, every one of them. I don't know if you all realize that when Jimi Hendrix played his guitar and made his guitar sound the sound of mourning and pain at Woodstock, though he was a paratrooper from the 101st. And as he played his guitar, he was playing the pain. He had put his life on the line, and yet when he came back here to America. And so today, veterans, you really can't retire. You really can't sit down and just have a once-a-year veteran service. You cannot be comfortable with your retirement money. You can't just say, I'm a proud member of the Army or the Navy. You've protected the country, but baby, brother, you got some protesting to do. You got some protesting to do. We've been in war now in this country for 18 straight years. A war that we went in over false information in Iraq. Huh? And every year we're finding out more and more reasons why that war was more about oil than it was about anything else. We got some protesting to do. We spent $3 trillion on that war while people are dying from poverty. Veterans, y'all got some protesting to do. We spend right now in this country 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on war machinery, not on veterans, and less than 15 cents of every dollar on health care, public education, and infrastructure to make our nation stronger. You got some protesting to do. Huh? Particularly as veterans who believe in God. If in God we trust, then that trust means we must challenge this nation. There are soldiers on food stamps. Soldiers who come back broken and battered and get treated disproportionately wrong, while the CEOs of weapons countries make an average of $19 million a year, and the average combat soldier makes less than a living wage. We return, but we must return fighting. One military contract taken from a company that's building machinery that the military doesn't even want. But just for greed, one military contract could fund every state that denied Medicaid expansion. And in this state of North Carolina, you got some protest veterans. You ought to be mad as heaven is at injustice. The fact that this state had refused to expand Medicaid and 30,000 soldiers are not getting health care in North Carolina because people in Raleigh, many of them who never went on a battlefield, are blocking health care. You can't retire. Just like David couldn't retire. He had to fight Goliath when he was young, and he was fighting Goliath's cousin with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot when he was old. You can't retire because if you're a person of faith, you've been drafted into the army of the Lord. And if you're in the army of the Lord, you promised him that you would serve him until you die. You have to know what a general told me one night on the plane. I was leaving Atlanta, and I was coming back this way, and we got on the plane, and this general got up, and he came to me, gave me his general coin, and then he thanked me, and I said, thank me for what? He said, for your work and the work of others in the cause of justice and love. And I said to him, I kind of find that strange coming from a general. He said, no, I'm a general, and if anybody knows that we need people to protest the nation, to question war, we need it. I know we need it because we need some folk that will put a check on the warmongers who will send other people's children into battle and not their own. The general told me that. The general knew what God tells us ultimately, and that is the only way you can protect the nation ultimately is to stop the oppressor, welcome the stranger, care for the least of these. Y'all better hear what I'm saying. Feed the hungry, give the thirsty something to eat and drink, welcome the immigrant, put clothes on. That's the only way. And you know what? I hear it again and again, and I hope every veteran gets it, because you did not swear to just protect this country from foreign enemies. I wish I had a witness here. That's not what you swore to. You swore to protect this country from foreign and domestic. Racism is a domestic enemy. The lack of health care is a domestic enemy. Not providing people with education is a domestic energy. Paying people less than a living wage is a domestic energy. And if you fought and went to foreign shores, then surely your service has not yet ended, because I see you sitting here, and the Bible says you must be a faithful service unto death. A faithful servant unto death. It doesn't say until death. If it said until death, Jerry, that means you're faithful until it looks like you're going to die. And then you say, well, I ain't going to be faithful no more because it's too hard, too much criticism, too many problems. That's not what the word said. The word says in Revelation, blessed are those who are faithful unto death, and then they shall receive a crown of life. And so, my brothers and sisters here and everywhere else, we must protect and protest the nation. And I find it in one of our greatest hymns that is also a prayer. Listen at it one more time as I take my seat. Oh, beautiful, for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains, majesties above the fruited plain. America, America, God has shed his... You ain't been so good, America. You ain't been so perfect, America. You better hurry up and wake up. It's God has shed his grace. And crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. And then that second verse. Always read the next verse of the hymn. Listen at it, what it says. Oh, beautiful for pilgrims' feet, whose stern impassioned stress a thoroughfare of freedom's beat across the wilderness. America, America, mend thine every flaw. There can be no nation where the leadership of that nation does not mend the flaws the flaws of racism, the flaws of homophobia, the flaws of sexism, the flaws of poverty. See, to be truly patriotic is to both protect and protest the nation until the day comes, as the hymn says finally, you confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. That's what Dr. King said. He said, I don't just want liberty on paper, on words. I want liberty in law. I want equal protection in law. I want everybody having a right to a public education fully funded in law. I want the human right to health care in law. I want the payment of a living wage in law. I want women paid the same thing as men for doing the same job in law. I want the refusal to treat anybody different because of their race, their color, their creed, their sexuality in law. Don't tell me you love me unless you're willing to put it on paper. That's what the song is saying. And veterans, thank God for how you protected the nation. Please, please also protest the nation until every flaw is mended and our liberty is confirmed in law. That's what Jesus calls of us. For he did not quit until he went on Calvary's hill, was died, and until our liberation was written in blood, redeemed, forgiven. Jesus could have said we were free. Jesus could have talked about us being free. Jesus could have dreamed about us being free. But greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for a friend. And the reason I know I'm free in Christ is because it's written in blood. My name's been signed by the blood of the Lamb. Wish I had a witness here. Huh? And it's grace that's brought us this far. And grace will lead us home. From sea to shining sea. Come on and give God a praise for God's grace and God's mercy.